Welcome to Theory of Pets. I'm a passionate pet owner with a drive to help others like me uncover the truth about the pet industry and what goes on behind the scenes.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining me today. My name is Connor, and I am the president of Top Dog Tips. I help our YouTuber, Samantha, continue to put out content for our YouTube channel, as well as content for our website, topdogtips.com. Today, we have Dr. Lindsay Kingsley back on here today. She's been on here a couple times. If you haven't seen those other podcasts, I highly recommend you check them out. Dr. Lindsay Kingsley, she is very knowledgeable when it comes to veterinary care. And today we're going to be talking about raw and homemade foods and the whole commercial dog food industry. And we're just going to get down in the nitty gritty here about all that kind of stuff. So I'm really excited. Thanks again for coming on, Dr. Kingsley.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
Cool. So let's start off with question number one. So how did homemade dog food come about?
So homemade dog food, there's a couple of different reasons. So initially, when there were some pretty big recalls a few years ago with some of the more mainstream commercial dog food, people were scared. They were looking for alternatives. They were looking for something that wasn't involved. I know there was a big hubbub. Hills had something happen with their vitamin D supplementation, and there were some dogs that were getting vitamin D toxicosis. So, just trying to find alternatives. Homemade dog foods came in, and then to even put more diesel on the homemade dog food fire, so to speak, there were a lot of fads going on in the human side, or on the human side, all the whole gluten-free diets and organic diets and, hypoallergenic diets and anti-inflammatory diets. And I think a lot of that got anthropomorphized into the pet industry. And that's where it's just maintained its momentum. And it's just really been fascinating to see all of the different trends and fads kind of wax and wane throughout the years.
Okay. And so as far as commercial dog food, what is the biggest gripe, I guess, you hear most of the time when people come into your office, and what's their biggest gripe, and why do they want to get on the homemade dog food diet or raw dog food?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it, again, going back to some of the recalls that have happened with commercial, not just dog and cat food, but even, horse feed. And you name it, there's been recalls in the human side of things. There's different frozen vegetables that go through recall, and it's just part of the food industry in general. There's a lot of concern about how much commercial food is processed and the different protein sources. For dogs that truly have dietary allergies or intolerances, people are trying to find an alternative to where they know exactly what's going into their dog's diet. Even if something says, it's chicken free or it's fish free, it still may be processed in a plant that will process products with chicken and fish. So you'll still have residues. So, and then there's just people who, they just want to feed what they consider is the best kind of food. So all organic, no antibiotics, that sort of thing.
Got it. Okay. And and then that births these two different types of I guess three, because I've also heard of freeze-dried dog food. So there's freeze-dried now there's homemade dog food, and then there's raw dog food. Could you tell me the difference between raw dog food and homemade dog food, I guess? And we can throw cat food in there as well.
Yeah, because cats are definitely on this gravy train, as well as different exotic species. So, taking a step back, it's been really fascinating navigating this as a veterinary professional, just as trends change. So to start, raw food is the concept of feeding completely uncooked protein sources. There's the barf diet, which truly is kind of a barf diet. It's bones and raw food, or biologically active raw food. And the thought process is what would a dog or cat eat in the wild? And they'd be eating whole prey, they'd be eating bones, they'd be eating intestine, they'd be eating essentially the awful OFFAL that we typically don't consume as humans. And I understand how people would think like, oh yeah, my husky is this just great wolf, it's this fierce canine and just a hunter at heart. But at the end of the day, I mean, our domestic species are just that. They're domesticated. If you look at, the dentition and the GI tract of a wolf or an African wild dog, and then you look at the dentition and the GI tract of a pug, we have navigated very, very, very far away from that spectrum. And although those species are still very much equipped to deal with that, some of our domestic species may not. So a lot of the raw diets aren't supplemented or fortified. So that's our raw component. And then our homemade diet is essentially cooked. So it can still be various protein sources, but it's usually a more traditional, chicken, fish, or a staple protein source you can get at a grocery store, supplemented with different, lentils, vegetables, potatoes, sweet potatoes, that sort of thing. And then may or may not be fortified with a supplement. And then the freeze dried is just kind of met in the middle. Some of the freeze dried are reconstituted with different supplement packets and that sort of thing. So at the end of the day, most of those diets are not evaluated by any sort of a professional. There's no minimum standard that's met. And so where we have commercial foods that have been tested and we know the exact caloric content, and we know the percentage of protein and fat and carbohydrates, we may not necessarily have the information on the raw, homemade, and freeze-dried diets.
Got it. So I wanted to ask you another question before we move on, because I noticed you were talking about dogs and cats and their GI tract. So are dogs carnivores or are they omnivores? Let's from a veterinary perspective, what's the answer to that question?
Yeah, so dogs are more like us. They're omnivores, omnivores, whereas cats are obligate carnivores. So and there's a huge difference physiologically that happens between the two. And again, looking at their teeth and how their teeth are developed, and looking at their GI tract and how long they are. A cat's GI tract is very, very short, whereas a dog's GI tract is a bit more like ours. It's kind of in the middle. So it's meant to process carbohydrates. It's meant to have some level of fiber, maybe not to what we are, but it does require that little bit to even feed the good bacteria in their GI tract and keep their normal flora stable.
Interesting. I was just gonna say, because I'm obviously not a veterinarian whatsoever, but I did take an online course that has to do with pet food nutrition, and at least the quote unquote the curator of the course is a veterinarian, and they formed it in a way to where looking at the dog's teeth, I'm sure you've heard of this, is where it looks like their teeth are meant for tearing and shredding rather than like molars like ours. So they're so they kind of make the basis that that they're carnivores. Like, have you heard that? I mean, I'm sure you've heard that debate. How did we get to that point to where it's like, I'm assuming maybe back then, dogs prior to domestication were more carnivorous.
Yeah.
And has their dental like changed at all, or like what are your thoughts about that? The fact that someone would kind of shape it to where they're carnivores and that, tease it up to be fed the raw diet versus kibble, and how there's carbohydrates in kibble.
Right. And I mean, it is kind of cool. Like you look at a wolf or a hyena or an African wild dog and their teeth compared to that of a pug or, a domesticated dog.
Mm-hmm.
The domesticated dog has a much rounder tooth. It's not nearly
Mm.
as long. They're much more flat. They have flat occlusal surfaces on some of their back molars. Their canines are more rounded, a little less pronounced. Their incisors are have less of kind of a shredding angle, so to speak. So I'm not saying that dogs are, they need a 50-50, they need a salad with their protein by any means, but they have over the years, way more so than cats. I mean, even looking at a cat's teeth versus domesticated dog's teeth, like there's some pretty stark contrast in, the how many teeth they have and how sharp the teeth they do have are. And so, as a proportion, it's still a very small amount of carbohydrates. Like we shouldn't be overloading these guys. Whereas cats, on the other hand, they should really have bare minimum carbohydrates that they can. Their body's just not meant to process it.
Got it. I'll make a mental note of that, because you said that there's not, their GI tract can process carbohydrates, but the amount is the important part, the dosage.
Yep, and the type too. So, I mean, not all carbohydrates are created equal. So, just like in the human side of things, eating a bowl of salad that has high carbohydrate but is high in fiber versus eating a loaf or a piece of white bread, still carbohydrates, but it's going to do very different things to your body.
Got it. Okay. And then, so now let's talk about the importance of the nutrition of their diet, and I guess it'll tee it up for, homemade cooked dog food and commercial dog food, and kind of weighing them out. So, what are the important vitamins and minerals that need to be included in those dog and cat diets? Well, I guess we'll start with dogs. What are the important vitamins and minerals that need to be included in those diets for dogs that commercial dog foods claim to have?
Yeah, so probably the biggest one that I see the most issue, especially in younger dogs or large breed dogs, is the calcium and phosphorus ratio. So that's super important for bone growth. And what's really concerning about that one is you don't always see, sometimes you do, but you don't always see the effects of having an imbalanced calcium and phosphorus ratio until years down the road. So osteoporosis in people, in women that have a diet that has an imbalance in calcium and phosphorus, they don't know that until they're much older and it's past the point of being able to do anything about it. So same thing in dogs that are fed these imbalanced diets. We may not know until much later, when we're maybe seeing more elbow dysplasia or hip dysplasia, or, in young large breed dogs, we do see it pretty quickly. We can see a condition known as HOD, or hypertrophic osteodystrophy, where essentially their wrists become very swollen and painful. And so that's the big, as far as just the mineral standpoint. And then obviously, sodium content, super important, especially pets that have any level of kidney issues or renal insufficiency, and then your vitamins, vitamins A, D, E, you name it, they're all found in trace amounts in these. So what we call fortified, and fortified just means that all of the vitamins and minerals needed to be a balanced diet are included or supplemented.
Got it. Okay. And is it true, because I learned that in commercial dog foods, because of the process of extrusion, that these vitamins and minerals can be cooked out. And so they kind of put them back in using sprays. And the whole thing about that is it's those are amino acids that are made in a lab. And because or those vitamins, if you have seen, I don't know, there's some YouTube videos going around and on how to read like a dog food label, and it's like it teaches you how to tell like what vitamins are synthetic and amino acids are synthetic. Is it true that those vitamins and minerals act differently? Because that's what has been kind of been passed around for people who are like very homemade dog food and raw dog food.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's a good point. And if we can deliver vitamins and minerals as a natural nutrient, meaning it's found in the food that we're providing, and typically, like, for instance, there's some fat soluble vitamins that you can find in vegetables. And then it's been found that if people eat them with rich dressing, like ranch dressing or Caesar or something like that, they're better absorbed because we have that kind of fat transfer. So same thing, if we have just a really nutritious, complete food item, then we're probably going to get the best bang for our buck in that one. But when we're looking at commercial pet foods, we have to create a product that will be stable, it will be safe, it will last, it will be palatable for the pet, and it will be the most nutritious that we can make, that we can have while fitting those parameters.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes that does mean, we have to create these synthetic things, because fat soluble vitamins, they're notorious for, high levels of fat, and fresh fat becomes rancid and it's not very stable. So weighing the pros and cons of, potentially having this very natural nutrition, but, it potentially causing the animal harm because it's gone bad, and then it's going to make them sick. The alternative is supplementing with synthetic nutrients that may not be as readily absorbed, but it's certainly better than feeding them something that's completely deficient.
Got it. Okay. All right. I was just okay. So what is your thoughts on if someone, or let's say someone's feeding their dog commercial dog food diet, it has these synthetic vitamins and minerals that are quote unquote sprayed or coated with these vitamins. It's a dog food that's coated with these vitamins and minerals, and then you have this person over here who's cooking homemade dog food, or they have a source, maybe it's someone that has a business or something like that makes homemade cooked dog food, and then they're also on top of that buying supplements because they know it's unbalanced in those vitamins and minerals, and then they meet those requirements. What would you say is better than the other?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, the supplements, almost all supplements are synthetic. So the synthetic supplements that are being added to the commercial dog food, and then the synthetic supplements that are being mixed into the homemade dog food to make sure everything's fortified, it's 6 in one hand, half dozen in the other. So, I mean, it's synthetic, but again, the difference is the commercial dog food has been put through the process of testing. It's been approved by AFCO, which is the American Association of Feed Control Officers, which is a subset of the FDA, are regulated by the FDA. So that food has gone through the process and checked all of the boxes saying this food is not deficient in this, and it has been supplemented with this, whereas the homemade food has not.
Got it. Okay. And what is the controversy that commercial dog food lack quality control and cut corners on protein sources? Is that accurate? Do you know?
So for the quality control, it depends on, so as far as a food safety standpoint, I would argue that animal, at least reputable commercial diets, are very well regulated. They're very well controlled.
Mhm.
That's part of the reason we get recalls. Everybody, I get pushback a lot, if I recommend. So prescription diets are really big for animals that have conditions like urinary issues, or renal kidney diets are really big. And when I recommend that, because we know it's been custom tailored for that pet's unique
Mhm.
needs, oh my God, you're recommending Hills or Purina. Didn't you know they had a recall? They had a salmonella outbreak, blah, blah, blah. So, well, the reason they had a recall is because they're being regulated. They're on the
Mhm.
radar, they're under scrutiny. So, not saying recalls are a good thing, but it is a metric that they are being regulated. So, um, that's one aspect of quality control. The other aspect of quality control is, as you mentioned, the protein sources. So,
Mhm.
us thinking about, a meal, meal, so fish meal or chicken meal or whatever it may be, which is essentially all the leftovers just thrown together and ground up. And so, whether that's bones or hoofs or livers or pancreas or things that we don't think like, ooh, yeah, that's, like a juicy hamburger or wagyu beef or a chicken breast, it's still a whole protein source. It's still animal protein, and it is still nutritious, but it is affordable, meaning we can create a somewhat balanced product for a price point that the average consumer can afford and give their pet.
Got it. Okay. And what are your thoughts on the past? I guess, I mean, I say decade. I'm sure there's more time as far as, but what are your thoughts on the past like decade or so of controversy that commercial dog food has come under?
I think there's some validity to it. I mean, could things be better? Absolutely. But what people don't recognize is, if we want these better protein sources, if we don't want to utilize the animal products and animal meals that sound really gross to us, if we're saying we demand fresh fish fillets, be in this stable food, we're going to have to pay for it. And I don't think anybody is really willing to go and spend $300 on a bag of dog food. Um, so it's really weighing the pros and cons, and getting the most well-rounded product. And again, commercial dog food, that's a huge blanket statement.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah. I try to do that just so I don't, you know, you don't want to call this company like
yeah,
out, you know what I mean? So I
exactly,
am using
exactly.
a general blanket statement for that reason.
Yeah, yeah. But Old Roy is very different than, even Purina's high end, their pro plan lines, their veterinary lines. Nulos are really great. They're actually based out of here in Austin, and they use really high quality ingredients. But again, you pay for it. So
Hmm. Got it. Okay. Now, when it comes to homemade dog food, and it comes to also like the raw food diet, are there any extreme examples? Like, I mean, I've heard things, I've heard like vegan or vegetarian diets for dogs. I think that's just because the person's vegetarian. Um,
yes.
are there any extreme ones that you've come in contact with? And yeah,
There's been some interesting ones. I mean, the vegan one and vegetarian diets is, I mean, that's where I draw the line. I mean, I try and remain pretty neutral. And if
hmm
you do something, as long as you're doing it right, and as long as you're going through the proper avenues and hitting the proper checkpoints, go for it. If
hmm
you want to be an all-star, I mean, I can barely feed myself balanced, nutritious meals. So to be able to provide that for both me, I think my pets still eat better than I do. But um, the vegan and vegetarian diets are just, I've not yet found a way around that, and to say, okay, yeah, this is appropriate, or this can be a good long-term solution. I feel like some of the raw diets, the awful diets where people just go to their butcher and get bone chunks of bone and, whatever is left over. As we talked about before, dogs' teeth have evolved. Their bones aren't bad, but we see a lot of dogs that are on the bone and raw food diets that have fractures of their teeth. We've seen dogs that have had gastric perforations from eating a bone that's gotten lodged, and animals have actually passed away from that. Some of the raw foods that even the owners will get food poisoning because they're feeding raw chicken, and then there's raw chicken residue on the food bowls and on the prep surfaces. And so those would be the more extreme versions, I would say.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, so I guess we can, instead of talking about unbalanced homemade dog food, let's talk about how people can make sure their homemade dog food is balanced. Now, what if, because I know, let's say, because here's this issue that I see that's going on. And this is obviously no offense whatsoever, but I from what I've seen, a lot of people at least on social media and personal experience speaking to people, is that they will say something along the lines, I don't trust my veterinarian, but I can't find a pet nutritionist nearby. So
Yeah.
how would someone go about trying to find a way to balance homemade dog food to make sure it is nutritious, if it is a great option?
Yeah. So veterinary nutritionists, they can be difficult to come by. There's very few places where you can just walk in, but now that we live in such a small world, in the sense that you can log on or go online and have an online consult with a veterinary nutritionist. The American College of Veterinary Nutritionists, acvn.com, they actually have a comprehensive list of all the veterinary nutritionists in the country, and many of them will do remote consults. So
Wow,
I would
that.
encourage, so and to really put my flag in the ground as to where I stand, if I had the time to do a homemade diet and I had a veterinary nutritionist on standby, that's what I would feed my pets. But I don't have either of those things at my luxury. So I feed a very high quality commercial diet that I know is balanced.
Got it. Yeah, I actually I recently switched over to homemade cooked dog food. Before that, I picked a higher end, to my knowledge at least. This company is called Carnivore. Are you familiar with them?
I am not in intimate detail familiar with them, but it's been on my radar. I've heard of them.
Yeah, I think I liked it because of the high protein content. Their carbohydrates was more on the lower end. I know that. I mean, which I want to touch on as far as the pet food labels in a bit here. But yeah, I really liked them. Okay, so I feel like we kind of went through most of the questions.
Yeah. One thing I did want to touch on. So, I know through this whole conversation, I've really seemed to lean more heavily on the commercial side of things, but some of the issues that I have seen with homemade diets, again, homemade diets are not evil, but I more often than not see homemade diets or raw diets done wrong than I see them done right. And one big topic that's been really in vogue lately is the issue of grain-free diets and potentially causing heart disease in dogs. And right now, as it stands, the jury is out as to whether or not that is a 100% tie. But I will say that I have seen several dogs and a cat that have been on homemade, specifically either on grain-free commercial diets or And when I say commercial diets, they've been kind of boutique foods.
Mm-hmm.
One was on a vegan diet, and then the others were on homemade diets. That did develop, we just would go in for their annuals, like, oh, well, they have a new heart murmur. That's interesting. Have you noticed any exercise intolerance? Well, maybe we went for a walk and maybe she's just not, she doesn't have quite the pep in her step, or yeah, you know what? She stopped and turned around and usually she's good to go for another, couple blocks. And so we do an echocardiogram or cardiac workup, and sure enough, these dogs would have early signs of DCM, or
Wow.
dilated cardiomyopathy. And when we tested their taurine levels, which is a really crucial amino acid that's utilized in the heart muscle, they were quite low. And we switch up their diet, recheck in months later, their taurine levels would come back up. And in one dog, we actually saw a huge improvement. We did have to start a cardiac medication for her, but in the other animals, it was irreversible. It didn't get worse
Wow.
once we'd corrected it, but that's one of the biggest things and one of the more concerning things that I see on a day-to-day basis.
And that was because of these people or these pet owners that were feeding their dogs specifically like strict grain-free, whether that was commercial or homemade dog food.
Yes. And when we say grain-free, not all grain-free diets are evil. I mean, it's gotten to a point where I've seen those cases and I just say, when in doubt, just stay away. Honestly, the whole grain-free, that's one of the things that has been extrapolated from the human side of things. The actual number of dogs that truly have an allergy to grain is exceptionally low. So
Yeah.
it's only about 1% of dogs that have skin allergies that's related to a food allergy. And then even a smaller percentage of those dogs, usually it's a protein source that's
Mm-hmm.
the culprit and not so much the grains. I mean, certainly things like wheat and soy can potentially be a trigger, but in the grain-free diets, we still have to provide that small component of carbohydrate. So we're replacing it with legumes and peas. And the running theory is that those, I guess, their substitute, so to speak, will actually block the absorption of taurine in the dog. So that's where we're getting these taurine deficiencies. It's not so much that they aren't even not unsupplemented. There's just an imbalance in the diet that's making it less bioavailable.
Interesting. I was gonna ask. So let's say I thought it was cats are the ones that really needed taurine. I thought dogs were able to manufacture taurine based off their diet. Is that what it is?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And
But
dogs,
they
yeah,
don't get
and
taurine directly from the diet, but they're able to use the food.
synthesize.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Got it.
yeah.
Okay.
And whereas cats absolutely need the supplementation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but because cats are obligate carnivores, I don't think we see things block that absorption like we do on the dog side of things. But yeah, cats are absolutely non-negotiable. They need their taurine in their diet.
What would you say causes the blocking of the taurine? Is it a lack of protein? Is it, or is it, I guess you said, the grain-free diets, is it just pretty much because they've cut out grains altogether?
It's hard. I mean, honestly, Connor, that one's a little over my pay grade. That's
Uh-huh.
a veterinary nutritionist standpoint. And again,
Okay.
this is all kind of a running theory, the clinical studies and trials, and the legwork that needs to be done to be able to say this is fact and this is law, haven't been done. But it's just the association that it's really the grain-free foods that are supplemented with the legumes and the peas. And from my knowledge, they are at least fortified with taurine, maybe not to the level that they need to be, but those are the diets. And the suspicion is that the peas and the legumes are what's causing the issue with the lack of absorption. Now, if we just over supplemented with taurine, could it just completely make that negligible. I'm not sure. That's just kind of the running standpoint, and just anecdotally, we are seeing it on the veterinary side of things.
Okay.
And that's both from the grain-free diets as well as the diets that are purely homemade that just don't have the proper amount of taurine needed to maintain a healthy heart.
Wow.
Namely, in cats, that's the more common.
Okay. And so I'm going to ask you a couple hardball questions here, just because I'm very curious. So there's been this nagging thing that kind of has bothered me, and it was just something that was pointed out on that course that I took about carbohydrates. And I know a lot of pet food manufacturers use it because it's a starch and it can bind the kibble into the little wafer.
Exactly. Yeah.
So now you said dogs need carbohydrates. I think I agree to an extent. I think since I've heard that, and I think it's a good theory, is that since they're domesticated, I mean, I take my dog on like maybe, 2 to 3 walks a day. So, but she's not hunting and scavenging. So, the carbohydrates is not going to harm her. I agree that there's a certain extent, but I've noticed that there is no minimum or maximum of carbohydrates on pet food labels. So I find that interesting, but there's minimum and maximums for, all the other nutrients that are on there.
Yeah. Yeah.
What are your thoughts about that? Why do you think they don't have a minimum or maximum? And they use, and just coincidentally, they use carbohydrates to bind the food.
Right. And that really comes into play more so in cat nutrition. So again, keeping it into perspective, what the ultimate goal of the commercial pet food industry is to create a stable, safe, relatively well-balanced product that's going to check all the boxes of nutrition in your pet. And that's not always the easiest thing to do. And if in cats, I always encourage the more wet food you can feed, the higher protein you're going to be able to get, the moderate level of fat, and it's usually a much lower carbohydrate level because you don't have to go through that process of binding that kibble into a little convenient, I think is the key word there, wafer that you don't. I know a lot of people, my brother will open a can of wet dog food or cat food and just immediately start gagging, and it's messy, it's not stable, it can go bad. So most people will reach, again, the average consumer, I know you're an absolute rock star dog dad, but they just want something they can reach for, they can scoop, put in a bowl, and not have to worry about it, and not really think about long-term repercussions. And to be able to create that product, there is a certain level of carbohydrates that has to go in just to make the product. And again, I would consider dogs omnivores, but to a much more carnivorous skew than humans are, for sure.
For sure.
But the protein and the fat content, to me, the higher you can get, the better. And the caveat being in an otherwise healthy pet. Now, once we start throwing in comorbidities, that can drastically change. But as far as, why the carbohydrate percentage is just flat out not included, I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay. So the course that I went through, obviously they piece everything together to where they like kind of lead you down this path. So I they talk about how there's no minimum or maximum for carbohydrates. And then they talk about how the pet food company is so evil because there is no minimum or maximum. So they'll just use so much carbohydrates, way too much. And that's why, and you can see, there is, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but I live in Jupiter, Florida. I see a lot of obese dogs at the beach. I know there's people who feed them scraps, off the table. And I'm not one of those people. Um, people might think that's mean. My dog does not eat my food, and I've trained her to where she doesn't stalk me when I around the kitchen when I eat food. But I'm just this baffling thing with the obesity. Now, they kind of in the course they piece it together to where they make it sound like carbohydrates is the problem.
And it,
Now, go
yeah,
ahead. What are you gonna say?
I mean, carbohydrates are the problem. I mean, you look at just even in human medicine, carbohydrates are the problem. And in same thing in cats. You know, the first thing we do when we have a diabetic cat, when cats they develop the same type of diabetes that more common in obese people,
Mhm,
meaning they're insulin resistant.
mhm,
You know, first thing we do is cut the carbohydrates. You know, all of the diabetic management prescription diets are all very low in carbohydrate.
mm,
Um, so I agree with you on that one.
mhm,
My best advice is if you have a healthy dog, you know, you do have the minimum maximum percentage of protein, you do have the minimum maximum percentage of fat. Whatever is left over, you know, we have our vitamins, minerals, other things like that. But the vast majority of whatever's left over in that percentage is going to be carbohydrates.
So basically, you would agree that probably there are some commercial dog food companies that abuse the use of carbohydrates to kind of because there's this also sorry to kind of pin you into a corner here with these questions, but just because I have I mean I've done nowhere near the amount of education and research that you have, but just this little bit I'm just curious because it's just I'm interested. So the carbohydrates thing, and do you feel like maybe people don't do that calorie equation as well?
Yeah. So, and again, kind of, I don't want to blame carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are not evil. They're a
Hmm.
problem, but I love my cereals and grains and everything
Oh,
else.
me
So,
too.
in moderation, but yes, I think in a general statement, if we have the average pet owner utilizing a commercial diet, one, I would recommend getting a very high quality one. And if you're unsure whether one is or not, just talk to your veterinarian. Are there some foods that are worse than others as far as abusing, quote unquote, the carbohydrates? Sure. I mean, carbohydrates are cheap. They are much cheaper than protein.
Hmm.
They're much cheaper than, you know, good balanced fats. And they create a stable product. So
And
that's
I've heard also is that they use so sometimes you'll see in the pet food label brown rice protein or pea
mhm,
protein.
mhm.
And the assumption, at least again, I'm just gonna this is only because this is the only education I've had on this pet food nutrition, is
Mhm.
that they use that protein because they kind of skimp out on the animal protein. Is that
It's, I mean, it's in, to say skimp out, I mean, it's the same thing in people. You know,
hmm
protein is expensive. You know,
hmm
anybody who's on, you know, the Atkins diet or paleo diet, uh, it's expensive and it's inconvenient. And so if you can afford it, then
hmm
by all means, you know, there are some commercial diets that are super, super high in protein and are still a kibble. But again, you're going to be paying, you know, over $100 for a bag of that food. And there's tons of people who are willing to do that, myself included, but the average American is not. You know, they just want
hmm
whatever is reasonably affordable and is going to keep their dog ticking moving forward. But, you know, if going back to the obesity standpoint, you know, that does come into play the caloric density of a food. So
hmm
if you have a low quality food that's really high in carbohydrates, then chances are that's going to be a much higher calorie per cup. And it's usually not a very well metabolized calories, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
In general, if I'm guiding a client, weight loss is not rocket science. It's unless you have something else going on like hypothyroidism or some sort of metabolic issue, the equation is increase activity, decrease caloric content.
Mm-hmm.
You don't really need to get too much deeper down the rabbit hole than that, if you're at least on just the jumping off point. So foods that are much higher in protein and are moderate to low in fat, usually those are a bit less calorically dense. If you have a pet that's super, super, super obese, then we start adding carbohydrates in the form of fiber. So, fiber are essentially empty calories. So it's, again, still a carbohydrate, but it's going in one end and it's coming out the other, and it's not really it's adding volume and making the pet feel more satiated, but it's not adding to the love handles, so to speak.
Okay. Well, I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll turn down the heat a little bit, and then we'll wrap up. So what are your thoughts about that basic measurement that on the back of the pet food bag that talks about, how much you should feed your dog per, based off of their weight? Now, do you feel like a lot of people get that wrong? Do you feel like a lot of people don't read that? Do you feel like that
Yes.
it's like they're like, oh, that looks like enough, or is it the lack of exercise, or is it a combination? What do you think? Or do you think that the pet food companies are evil and that they overfeed your dog so they can sell more, they can make more money?
So whether or not they're evil, I'll just say, most people I know and most pet owners overfeed their pet, whether it's their cat or it's their dog. I do have a little bit of grievance against the little tables on the back that say, oh, if your dog's weighs this much, feed him this much. It's like, okay, well, if your dog weighs 50 pounds and he has a body condition score of 4, absolutely, he might even need more of that. But if your dog weighs 50 pounds and he has a body condition score of an 8 out of 9, that dog is going to need like half of what that recommended food allotment is. So feeding your pet based off of weight is garbage, in my opinion. And it's just begging to either over or underfeed your pet based on their metabolic needs. A lot of the labels and the studies that have been done to say, okay, this is how we made this chart, are based off of dogs that are less than 2 years old. So they have the metabolism of a puppy. And then you buy this maintenance dog food, which is essentially made for all life cycles. And your dog that is now 6 or 7 and has a much lower metabolism needs a whole lot less than what that bag is recommending. And I get it. Like, you need to have somewhere to start. I'm as much of a grievance as I have with those tables, it's still better than somebody that's never had a dog before, because I don't know about your dog, but my dog will eat himself sick. He will eat until he looks like he swallowed a basketball, and we'll just be sick for 3 days if he somehow gets into the bag of dog food. So your dog is never going to be honest with you. So at least having kind of a baseline, like, this is where you should start. But at the end of the day, with any annual exam, nutrition is it's the fuel in the machine. So if you're ever unsure about something, talk to your veterinarian, and they can really help guide you on how accurate that table is. If you're feeding your dog too much, too little, or if they need something, a different diet completely, to really meet their needs.
Okay. So real quick, just to help, provide some resources for our listeners. So tell them what a body condition score is, and then tell them how, I think there's a chart. I'll have it. I'll have my editor put it up on the screen. It has a view of a dog, and if it like has different, like, you know what I'm trying to say, the body part, the body
Yeah.
types. It has
Yep.
one has ribs, one looks a little more like it's more full. The other one starts to look like the basketball belly that you're talking
Yep.
about, and
Yep.
then super overweight. And then they have the bird's eye view. So why don't
Yes.
you tell them what the body condition score is and explain that scale, because I'm curious about that.
Yeah. So an actual numeric weight for an animal is, I mean, that's the first piece of the puzzle. We have to really have a weight and a body condition score. And we rank body condition scores 1 through 9. Essentially, like you said, a 1 being Skeletor. There's no meat on their bones whatsoever. 4 to
Skeletor's jacked,
5.
by the way. I actually,
That is true.
I made that
Maybe
joke one time, and then I looked up Skeletor. His face is skeleton, but then he's like muscles. But
lean
I know what you
machine.
mean. He's like,
Yeah.
they're skin and bones.
Crypt keeper. We'll go with the crypt keeper.
Crypt
That's
keeper.
more, yeah. So, and then a 4 to 5 is ideal. So that's looking both, like you said, kind of a lateral view, or looking at the dog from the side. You know, they've got, you can't obviously see their ribs, but there's a little bit of a tuck from essentially their sternum to their hips, and a nice flat top line. They have good muscle definition. And then looking from the bird's eye view, there's a little bit of a waist between the ribs and the hips. It's where you start getting into the 7, 8, and 9, where that bird's eye view looks like an ottoman. It's just a rectangle, or God forbid, a rectangle with, you know, the little muffin top on the side.
Yeah.
And there's somebody made a meme with the cat body condition score, and it's, you know, it's like, oh, he's cute, and oh, we got a chonk and a super chonk, and oh lord, he's coming, you know, just massive cat.
He's rolling here.
He's rolling here. Yeah, there's no sunlight coming through this cat blob. His belly's dragging the ground. So having a body condition score and comparing it with the weight is really critical on saying whether your pet is over or underweight.
Okay. So to wrap up, you would say, though, if they can, and they can find a pet nutritionist, or they find a balanced raw food, you would recommend homemade dog food or cat food and raw food over commercial?
Again, if done right. And when I say if done right, it's either validated or consulted with a veterinary nutritionist. And not just saying, oh, I'm going to do this once and then I'm going to feed my pet this for the rest of its life. You know, if you're really hell-bent on feeding these raw diets or homemade diets, you need to recognize that your pet has different nutritional needs at every life stage. So what they need when they're a puppy is going to be very different than what they need as an adult, which is going to be very different than what they need as a senior. So having that relationship with a board certified veterinary nutritionist, and making sure you're doing it right. And if you're not willing to put in that legwork, which is okay, that's not evil, that's part of pet ownership. If you are not willing to put in that work, high quality commercial pet food, preferably consulted with your veterinarian to figure out what's going to be the best one for your pet, is a very reasonable option. You know, in the few studies that have been done at the moment, there's really not any definitive evidence that dogs on homemade or commercial diets have drastically different essentially lengths of life. You know, they live the same amount of time. So it's not evil to go either way.
Got it. Okay. And then I also I wanted to touch on this because you talked about salmonella with the raw food and that being a risk. I heard that in some healthy dogs that salmonella already exists in their gut. And I mean, I don't know if it's in all dogs, but there was a study done or something like that where they tested and they said like a certain percentage of those healthy dogs had salmonella in their gut. So what is really the issue about feeding them, if you're going to do raw food, I guess yourself, in the fact that there is a chance for salmonella if it's in their gut? Like, what's the difference between safe? And they also said that there's like a few only really, because isn't there like hundreds of different types of salmonella,
Yeah,
or is it
absolutely.
thousands?
It's I couldn't tell you how many zeros behind the number, but there are a lot of different species of salmonella. But there are a lot of things that can be considered normal flora, but it's all a numbers game. So if they're in small numbers, they're living happily with all of the good bacteria in a relatively normal ratio, there are things like salmonella, Clostridium, which is another really gnarly little bacteria that, if in high numbers, can cause just a bad time for both animals and people. Giardia, more studies have been done that we can see Giardia in the normal gut flora of puppies. But I think it really comes down to the testing. So the testing that you mentioned, that's not really, it could be related to a PCR. So we're finding just traces of a salmonella organism, or we'll find, traces of Clostridium, traces of Giardia, but they're not in high enough numbers to actually cause an issue. And salmonella is interesting in the sense that it's not continuously shed. So we can have a pet that has clinically significant salmonella that could be transmitted to a human, and we have to keep testing for it. Just because they come up as negative doesn't necessarily mean it's not there. So it's a little bit of a tricky one. But if we are taking the food of that pet that is just chock full of salmonella and then feeding it to them, that means it's going through the system and is then coming out and potentially causing illness in that animal. And then not only causing illness in that animal, but potentially being a zoonotic risk for the owner or, anybody else that comes into contact with that pet. So
does the same
I get where you're saying.
Does the same go for Giardia? I literally, my dog, this week, she's had diarrhea the past few days, but I took her to the vet and they did a fecal test and it was negative for Giardia and hookworm. Yeah, hookworm.
Yeah.
So does it go for the same thing? It's just they're not shedding in large amounts, so she's just gonna, it's a false negative. Is that what it's called?
Exactly. So we have, I actually just saw a puppy the other day. So she had completely normal stool, was happy, healthy, bouncing around, and came up positive on a Giardia PCR. And we're going to go ahead and treat her because it's the first time we've picked it up. But, if she's not showing any clinical signs, none of the other dogs are showing clinical signs, we instructed the owner, really not that it's kind of a gimme, because I don't think there's too many people walking around picking up their dog's feces with their bare hands and then biting their nail. Like, that's just gross. But just really saying, okay, use gloves, diluted bleach solution, clean the area, act like there's potentially a contaminant in this stool. But there's a good chance that when we retest her, it may still come up positive. And at that point, we're not just going to continue to pump her full. Like, it may just be something that's a normal flora and that she'll clear as she gets older. Now, if she breaks with diarrhea, it's going to be very, very different.
Got it. Okay. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground here. You touched on a resource. I want to, refresh if someone has made it this far, maybe they didn't take notes, but you mentioned a resource about how someone could do an online consult with a veterinary nutritionist. What's the name of that website?
Yeah, so that is the American College of Veterinary Nutritionists, or the ACVN. And their website has a lot of great resources on how to get in touch with a board certified veterinary nutritionist.
Is it .com or .org?
Let me double check that it is. It is .org. You are correct.
Okay, cool. So they'll be able to they'll be able to speak with a nutritionist, because like I said, it's hard to find. I don't know any here in South Florida, or at least around my town whatsoever. So I'll definitely be using that. But other than that, thank you for taking the time today. I found this really interesting. Sorry for the tough questions at somewhere in the conversation. I was just curious, but I felt like I wanted to ask it because I wanted to get your perspective on it. Tell everyone where they can find out more about you on social media, as well as the company you're also partnered with, Better Vet.
Yeah, so Better Vet, we're a nationwide house call practice. And if you've never pursued or tried a house call visit for your pet's veterinary needs, I'd highly encourage to give it a try. It's a much lower stress experience for them, for you. It's convenient. So you can find us at www.bettervet.com. And if we're not in your area, we probably will be soon. You can find us on Instagram with our handle. We're just Better Vet. And then if you want to see bicycles, motorcycles, and cute Swedish Valhunds, you can find me at motodoc_46.
Cool. Well, I'm definitely going to be signing up going forward, because the last podcast we talked about was vaccines, and I think my past vet might have given her a vaccine that she didn't need, and so I'm like, oh, okay. So I'm interested in using Better Vet as well. Everyone, go ahead and check it out. All right, that'll do it for us here at Top Dog Tips. Thanks for listening, everyone. If you like our content, please be sure to like this video and subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you're listening on a podcast, make sure to share this podcast with your friends, as it was full of very, very educational information. And with that, I hope you all have a great day, and we'll talk to you soon.